to another action-packed lecture on Immanuel Kant. We're back for part 2 of our lecture 11 on deontology. We'll pick up here shortly, again, with Kant's propositions of morality. Just to briefly review what we've talked about in the first part of the lecture, part 1. We talked about, introduced Kant, talked about him, who he is, his importance in the history of philosophy and a number of subjects. We talked about deontology in general, tried to characterize, what sort of moral theory it is, what kinds of things it emphasizes. Gave some examples, I think, that helped really draw out the differences. And again, we've been playing on those differences between deontology and the points they're emphasizing, and then the utilitarians and consequentialists and the points they're emphasizing. We've already been playing on those, talking about those rather, since the beginning of lecture 7. But we gave some more examples, hammering home some of the main points of deontology. Started detailing Kant's own, version of deontology, talking about the significance of this idea of a goodwill and how it's kind of the, again, if you want a defensible moral theory, Kant suggests you have to proceed, right? You have to, in such a way, you have to proceed with this idea of a goodwill, and it has to be the measuring stick, if you will, of everything else that's good or desirable, right? And what does a goodwill look like? Well, that's kind of what we're fleshing out in these propositions of morality. So we talked about the first two at the end of the part 1 lecture, but he's trying to flesh out what he means by duty, and a goodwill ultimately amounts to upholding your duties. Okay, so this duty talk's very important, and he's fleshing out this concept of duty in these propositions of morality, the first two of which we've already discussed. Remember the whole idea that it's not good enough to act merely as duty requires. Of course, that's required. Okay, if you're robbing a bank, if you're stabbing someone, etc., clearly what you're doing is not morally praiseworthy. The point, though, is even if you are acting as duty requires, remember the 2 check boxes. Even if you've marked that off, that's not good enough for Kant, right? You need to also be doing it because duty requires. You need to have that rational recognition that this is what your duty requires, okay? And that has to be the motivating factor. That has to be the reason why you're doing what you're doing, okay? It's not good enough just to be doing what your duty is. You have to be doing it for the right reasons. And that gets in then to the second proposition, which I dumbed down and suggest it's really, what matters is not what we're trying to do. Again, it kind of matters, right? If you're robbing a bank, obviously we can dismiss what you're doing from the get-go. But even when what you're trying to do, again, acts of benevolence, for example, or to try to cure world hunger, we talked about. Even that's not going to be what's most important, right? Whether or not you actually bring that what about. Rather, the most important factor is the why you're trying to do that what. Okay, so you've got to, again, dig deeper, go before the act, what precipitated the act, get into the mind of the agent, if you will, and unearth their motive or intention. That's what ultimately mattered. Were they engaged in the proper reflection? Did they realize what their moral duty was in that particular instance? If so, then regardless of what the what is, and regardless of whether or not they're successful in accomplishing the what that they're trying to do, they're morally praiseworthy, period. And then the opposite also holds true. Regardless of the what and whether they're successful in bringing it about in experience, if they have the wrong why, if they're selfishly motivated, if they lack that rational reflection, okay, that's required of a moral agent to properly act morally, as we'll see, right, they have to be acting completely autonomously. It's just a rational process for Kant. So if that's lacking, right, they don't have the proper why, they're not motivated in the proper way, then they're not morally praiseworthy, Kant wants to say, regardless of what transpires in experience as a result of, what they're doing, right? Regardless if they're successful in accomplishing the purpose or the object of their action, as he would say, and they, let's say, cure world hunger or cure cancer, doesn't matter. They're still morally blameworthy from Kant's position, right? Because, again, that empirical stuff, what happens in our experience, that shouldn't matter from a moral perspective. And if you let that seep in and focus on that, then we'll have the kinds of issues we we alluded to in the first part of the lecture. So that brings us up to speed. Then we're going to again start with the third proposition of morality here in a moment, which hopefully you'll see why I waited then and started with this here for the second part video, because there's some things we're going to unpack. We'll see in this third proposition of morality, he uses the concept of a law, which will remind us of Aquinas again, right? We'll also unpack the idea of imperatives and maxims. We'll talk about the difference between a hypothetical and a categorical imperative. Of course, this is going to be the aha, right? Hence the asterisks here, okay? That categorical imperative, that's going to be the golden ticket to deducing and figuring out what all our moral truths and standards are, what all our duties are in some sense. Okay? And then we'll end by discussing, the famous 4 illustrations of duty that he offers, and also the distinction between autonomy and heteronomy. Right? Kant's going to say that we have to be acting completely autonomously of our own accord, which is going to involve for him due rational reflection. All that has to be involved, and that's a completely autonomous process. Or else what we're doing, right, is in some sense being dictated by these external influences, and for him that's no good. What we're doing is not pure enough, and so we're not morally praiseworthy, again, unless we're acting completely autonomously. So that's what we'll end with. So that's the game plan here. Let's go ahead and dive in then and talk about the third proposition of morality here. Okay, and so he says, this is on page 200 of our text, quote, duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law. Okay, and what he's getting at here is this idea of moral law. Okay, so we have this notion that duty is the necessity of an action. We have that idea of necessity, and that's going to be wrapped up in this notion of an objective principle of action. More on that in a second. But this idea that it's spelling out something that's necessary. Okay, so duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law. So as a rational agent, the idea is Kant's going to say, right, duty is doing what is deemed necessary out of respect for the moral law. Okay, and this will make a little bit more sense as we proceed here. Now remember, for him, the only thing that's morally worthy of respect is sort of the principle or the reason why you're doing what you're doing. Okay? Never what's going to result from the action. If that was what you have in mind, that's no good for Kant, right? That reflects some sort of subjective interest in your part, typically, and some sort of the dirty word for him is inclination. That's a bad word, a dirty word. If that is entering the equation in terms of why you're doing what you're doing, then you are not morally praiseworthy, okay? You should not be acting because you have an inclination to do so. You should be acting because your duty requires you to do so. Or at the very least, maybe there's not always an applicable duty with respect to the scenario. You should always have at least exercised your rational capacity and reflected on the situation and ensured, that in acting as you are about to do, that you're not violating any duty. Okay? In which cases you can act on your inclination, provided, right, it's not at odds with any duties, right? If in acting on those inclinations, you're not violating any duties. And that'll always require, again, the proper rational reflection. So if this is the driving factor, if this is dictating what you're doing, that's never any good, right? You've always got to be reflecting on what duty requires. So he says on 200 to 201 of our text, quote, an action done for duty must altogether exclude the influence of inclination. There it is, that dirty word. And therewith every object of the will. Hence there's this idea that it's pure, right? There's nothing else dictating it or influencing it. So let me start over again here. Quote, an action done from duty must altogether exclude the influence of inclination and therewith every object of the will. Hence there is nothing left which can determine the will. So we're trying to figure out what a good will amounts to, right? In this case, then there's nothing left which can determine the will except objectively the law, the moral law. I should follow such a law even if all my inclinations are thereby thwarted. So there's this idea, the goodwill, right? If we want a defensible version of morality, we have to have this idea of goodwill, and it's going to amount to having the respect for this notion of the moral law, which you will uphold even when it's at odds with what you actually want to do, right, or your inclinations. So there's something special about this so-called moral law something that's deemed necessary about it from a rational agent's perspective. We always have to our duty is to always, our duty amounts to always acting out of respect for the moral law, which in some sense, I've been mentioning this moral law. When he says law, here he's referencing the moral law, which is essentially following the categorical imperative. And more on that here in a moment. We'll see exactly what that amounts to. Okay, but that's the kind of thing he's getting at here. Okay, we can't be driven by inclination. We have to instead, if we have a good will, it has to be driven by a more pure motive, which is going to amount to respect for this idea of the moral law. Okay, and that'll make a little bit more sense again here in a moment. So I want to talk real quick about, so he suggested this idea of a law, right? We're respecting this moral law. Remember, for Kant, this is the top of slide 20, by the way, just as it was for Aquinas, so I mentioned this at the very top of slide 20, just as it was for Aquinas, and here we're seeing a similarity between the two again, morality and rationality are very much intimately connected. And you can't divorce the two. What allows us to be moral creatures, to be able to figure out, what is moral and to be worthy of moral respect in some sense, according to Kant, is our very rational nature, is our rational capacity itself. I remember everything we said about Aquinas and the idea of the natural law, and it's our rational capacity that kind of turns on the light for us and sort of clues us into this idea of good and evil, according to Aquinas, right? That certain things are good and that we ought to pursue them, and certain things are evil and that we ought to avoid them, right? The first precept of the natural law. So again, Kant very much echoes Aquinas in suggesting that morality and rationality are intertwined, interconnected. So note, for example, what he says on page 209 of our text. He says, quote, the principles should be derived, and so he's talking about a moral theory here, should be derived from the universal concept of a rational being in general, since moral law should hold for every rational being as such. So he's suggesting, in some sense, if you think about it, that whatever's true morally, it's accessible a priori. Remember all that stuff, right? And it's going to apply to every rational agent that exists. So it's not something that's uniquely human, in other words, provided there are other rational agents out there. And rationality is something that's objective. Typically the idea is if you're utilizing it properly, you'll arrive at the same definitive conclusions, right? Everyone will arrive at the same definitive conclusions about things. And so the idea here is, provided there are other rational agents out there somewhere, the same moral standards and truths will apply to them as well. It doesn't matter who you are or when you exist or what species you are, provided you have this rational capacity, which then gives birth to this ability to be moral in the first place, then these moral truths that we deduce by way of reason are going to apply equally to you, provided you have this rational capacity. So it's all rooted in that ability to reason. And that isn't necessarily something that's necessarily uniquely human, right? There are other species out there somewhere, or other aliens or whatever, right? Whatever you want to call them, that are rational in the same sense, right? Then they're going to have the same moral principles that apply to them, same duties that they ought to uphold, and so on. Okay, so remember, he had this notion, right, in the third proposition, duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law. Now, what does he mean by a law? Okay, keep it simple, as I suggest in the middle of slide 20. So it's something like a generalization that describes recurring facts or something that happens, right? So one way I describe it is it's a pattern, right? A pattern of behavior. One example I give is when heated to 100 degrees Celsius, water will boil. Okay, so it's just patterns in nature. Okay, and what it means to be rational, it seems in part for people like Kant and Aquinas, is that we have the ability to conceptualize or recognize these patterns in nature, if you will, right? These natural laws. Things like when we heat water to 100 degrees Celsius, it boils, right? We have this conscious awareness of that. And that's, I think, critically for Kant, Aquinas, and others, a defining feature of what it means to be a rational being. We have that awareness, and that's what distinguishes us from other sentient creatures, dogs and so on. Is now they're all subjected to the same natural laws as are we, right? But they don't have the awareness of it, and that again seems to be the defining feature of our rationality for these thinkers. So that's the critical feature, because here's the sort of turning point, and where we then, thanks to this rational capacity, have the ability to be moral in the first place. And why reason's so important, because Kant wants to say that just as we have this reason allows us to recognize these patterns, these laws of nature, if you will, so too then we can reflect upon potential practical laws or laws of behavior, if you will, or ways of behaving. And we can sort of try to then practically implement our own laws. Remember how Aquinas said that laws are in us in two ways as rational creatures, right? We're still subject to all these laws, that God put in place, just as other creatures are. But then as rational creatures, we are also able to dish out laws, if you will, right, as well. And so Kant's picking up on that same sort of idea, and that's what allows us to be moral, right? We have the ability to, again, recognize all the natural laws out here, okay, but then we also have the ability to reflect on ways that we would or would not want to be sort of laws of behavior, if you will. So, for example, we can reflect on, last time I was in need of money, I went to my local bank and robbed it. We can reflect on that and think, would we want that to be a kind of universal way that people behaved when people were in need of money, they just go to their local bank and rob it? Is that what we would want? People to behave like that? So in other words, think of it like this. We have the capacity to think of that and reflect on it and imagine it being a kind of a law, if you will, a law of nature. Just as, heat water to 100 degrees Celsius and it'll boil. We have the capacity to imagine different ways of behaving, right? In every instance where someone was in need of money, they go and rob their local bank. Would we want a world where that was a universal way of behaving, or a kind of law on par with heat water to 100 degrees, it will boil, right? And that's the ticket, right? We have that capacity to mull over potential universal ways of behaving or practical law. That's going to be the ticket. And so, of course, as we'll see, the idea is going to be, if you wouldn't want it to be a kind of law on par with, say, heating water to 100 degrees, it boils, then the idea is going to be you ought not to do whatever it is you're going to do. Go and rob the local bank when you are in need of money. Alternatively, if you have something in mind and, when I'm hungry, I shall eat food, right? And you think about that, well, is that something I can universalize? Right? And it seems to be not as objectionable, right? We don't seem to encounter problems for one reason or another. And so that's permissible. But the idea is, we'll flesh all this out in much more detail here shortly. The idea is, if you can't universalize it, or wouldn't want it to be a way that people universally behave, then you have a duty not to act in such a manner. So that's where he's going to be going, and that's what he's getting at in this third proposition of morality. So to unpack that a little bit more, let's turn to a quick discussion here of a distinction between imperatives. Oh my gosh, I've got so much up here. I guess I'll leave all that. It's pretty important. So imperatives versus maxims. Okay. He references imperatives, refers to them as objective principles of action, as commands of reason. So the idea is, and if you're familiar with the colloquial sense of imperative, it's imperative that you do that. The idea is you're obligated to do it, right? And that's the sense in which it's objective and necessary, right? You have to do it. It's something that's necessary. It's imperative that you do it. It's necessary that you do it, and it's objective in the sense that it doesn't matter who you are. If you want X, then imperatives are spelling out something that's necessary or required, okay, for you to get X. Okay. And we'll say a little bit more about imperatives here in a moment. Now, so just remember for now, right, the idea is they're objective. They're spelling out something that's necessary for everyone, provided they have a certain want, right, X. We'll call it X for now. Maxims, on the other hand, they're said to be subjective, right? They're a subjective principle of action. So I referenced these briefly in the first part of the lecture, the first video. and mentioned for at that point just to kind of think of them as being a motive. And when I'm in class or face-to-face class, I typically, again, we're trying to simplify simplify this as much as possible. And I think the best way to think of a maxim is kind of just a motive expressed in a universal way, right? So in a slightly different way than you might express your motive, right? So going back to what I was just saying, right? Why are you eating? I'm hungry, right? That was my motive. Why are you eating that food on that dish? I'm hungry. That's my motive. My maxim, if I was to express my maxim, it might be something like, when I am hungry, I eat food, right? So it's just the motive expressed in kind of more universal way, if you will. And for now, right, the main thing we want to take out is that it's subjective. It just references whatever happened to motivate a moral agent to do whatever it is that they happen to be doing at that time, right? So it's subjective in the sense that it could be different, right? We could ask, pull a bunch of different people entering a grocery store. Excuse me, what's your maxim? You're about to walk into this grocery store. What's your maxim? Of course, they'll give you a bunch of concerned looks, might try to lock you up, wonder what you're doing. And then you explain you're a Kantian, you're just trying to distinguish what their maxim is, so on and so forth, if they're morally praiseworthy. But the thing is, they might all have different motives or maxims. Most of them will probably have something similar, right? When I'm in want of food, I go to my local grocery store and acquire it. But you might encounter people with different, maxims. When I'm bored, I go to my local grocery store and loiter. Maybe we encounter a group of teenagers or something like that, and that's their maxim. So again, it varies. It picks out whatever's motivating the moral agent at the time. Okay. So at the bottom of 21, the upshot of all this is the goodwill. If we want again, a credible sense of a goodwill, it's only going to be possible when one's maxim, the reason why someone's doing whatever they're doing, aligns with the categorical imperative. More of that in a moment. Okay? What one's duty is going to require of them. Okay? So in other words, why does they're doing what they're doing, right? The subjective principle of their action can't be at odds with what their duty requires, or what the categorical imperative requires of them. Okay. So we mentioned this idea of the categorical imperative. Turning to slide 22 here. What is this notion of the categorical imperative? Well, let's distinguish it from hypothetical imperatives, of which there are many. There's only one categorical imperative. Okay? There are many hypothetical imperatives. And it's the idea that I mentioned a moment ago, right? We have all kinds of hypothetical imperatives. You have a desire to accomplish something. Well, there's going to be all sorts of related hypothetical imperatives. Okay, they're hypothetical in the sense that they're spelling out something that's necessary, but they're hypothetical in the sense that, provided you desire X, then all that stuff's necessary, right? But if you don't desire X, then it wasn't necessary. So let's see, you want to be healthy. I think that's the example I give. If you wish to remain healthy. So if you wish to remain healthy, then doesn't matter who you are. I mean, for the most part, right? You have to eat healthy, exercise regularly, let's say. And so that's the related hypothetical imperatives, right? You want to remain healthy, then you've got to eat healthy, exercise regularly, so on and so forth. But it's a hypothetical imperative in the sense that, let's say you're suicidal. Well, you don't have that desire, right, to remain healthy. So that stuff's no longer necessary. So again, an imperative in general, spelling out something that's necessary. It's objective in the sense that it applies to everyone. It doesn't matter who you are. It's spelling out something that's necessary. And hypothetical imperatives spell out, right, something that's necessary to get something you want, right? You want, again, to remain healthy, then you got to do yada, yada, yada. You want to pass this class, then you got to do yada, yada, yada. You want to remain out of jail, then you got to not speed, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now, what's the problem with all hypothetical imperatives for Kant? Okay. It's good that they're objective. There's something objective about them because, again, the idea with rationality is there's going to be something pure, objective that apply to everyone. But what's the problem with the hypothetical imperatives? The problem is they hinge on something we want or desire to bring about. Right? And we already know, right, that he wants to rid our moral theory from anything to do with the impure empirical world, anything that hinges on bringing about things that we want and feeding our inclinations, right? Acting on our inclinations. Okay? Hypothetical imperatives, they are geared towards satisfying, in some sense, something we want. Okay? That's not going to be any good. And we want something that's necessary no matter what, categorically. What's going to be something that's necessary and objectively applicable no matter what, all the time. And that's where we get this idea of the categorical imperative. So turning to slide 23. So a categorical imperative, on the other hand, is something we always ought to do. Always, right? It's something that's deemed necessary from a rational agent's perspective. Kant's going to say if you're truly being rational, then the categorical imperative is going to spell out something that's always necessary, no matter what circumstances you're facing and experience, and no matter what your particular inclinations are. And these are the things, right? Or it's going to spell out something that's always necessary for you. Okay? But the question is, if we remove, right, because we got to remove all our wants and desires from the equation, well then, in what sense is anything any longer necessary? On what basis would it be necessary? And Kant acknowledges that. Right? He says, so the issue then becomes on 201, quote, but what sort of law can that be, the thought of which must determine the will without reference to any expected effect, so that the will can be called absolutely good without qualification? And so he provides his answer then, also on 201, quote, there is nothing left to serve the will as principle, right, nothing pure at least, except the universal conformity of its actions to law as such, end quote. So what does he mean by that? Well, as he also says in 201, basically, quote, I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law, end quote. Going back to what I mentioned, 10 minutes ago, the idea is going to be if it's not going to be something you would want or could possibly think of as being universal, right, or a way that people universally behave, on par with heating water to 100 degrees, it boils, then don't do it, right? Then the idea is you ought not to do it. Okay? That's what's always necessary all the time from a rational agent's perspective, Kant wants to say. Okay? That is what's always applicable, categorically, always necessary. Okay? Again, what is it? I should never, at the very bottom here, I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxims should become a universal law. Okay? So I should never act unless what I'm going to do, I'm okay with it being a way that people would universally behave in similar circumstances. So going back to the bank robbery example, I wouldn't want everyone that was in need of money to go, nor would you, to go and rob their local bank, because we wouldn't have banks then. Right? The very idea, and he has a similar example of promises towards the end. The very notion of a bank, that banks wouldn't exist. Right? So he would likely argue, right, that we have a perfect duty not to do that, because the very existence of banks, wouldn't be there. They wouldn't even exist if people were constantly robbing them. So again, you have to take whatever you're about to do. So take whatever action it is you're about to do, formulate the relevant maxim, if you will, right, in Kantian talk here, which is basically you just expressing your motive in a kind of universal way, and then ask yourself, would that maxim be something that could possibly be, or would it be something I would want to be a universal law or universal way that people behave? And if the answer is no, then don't do it. You have a duty then not to act on that maxim. And that's the gist of it here. So I mentioned the grocery store examples, or the example, right, of quizzing people that are going in the grocery store. A relevant maxim might be, when I'm hungry and have no food, I shall go to the grocery store and buy food. I mentioned that. Alternative maxim, when I'm bored, I visit my local supermarket, okay, and loiter about. Okay, so going back to this maxim, when I'm hungry and have no food, I shall go to the grocery store and buy food. There's relevant hypothetical imperatives then. Right? If you want to sustain one's life, if you want to sustain your existence, you have to eat. Right? If you want X, you got to do Y. If you want to eat, you must acquire food. Right? All these are relevant hypothetical imperatives that are at play with respect to that maxim, right, of having to go to the grocery store when you're hungry to acquire food. Right? So hopefully this is starting to make a bit of sense here. I mean, in general, if you take nothing else away from it, from Kant, right, who can be notoriously difficult, know this idea of the categorical imperative. That's the distinguishing factor of deontologists like Kant, right? This idea that what's morally required of us is to only act in ways, right, that we can universalize. Okay? Let's turn then to, actually, let me give you my other example, right, the bank robbery one. I forgot to express it like this. So when I'm in need of money, this is if we were to couch it in the form of a maxim, right, that motive of needing money. When I am in need of money, I shall rob the closest bank without getting caught. Now, notice how I phrased that there. Rob the closest bank without getting caught. Some relevant hypothetical imperatives. If one wishes to remain unidentified when conducting bank robberies, one must wear a mask or kill all witnesses. Right? You're spelling out things that are necessary, provided you have that want, right, of robbing the bank without getting caught. Right? So now, what are the? Let's go. I forgot. Right, the most important point here. Going back to both of these examples, the grocery store and the robbing bank, the categorical imperative, applying that's the same. That's always the same for rational creatures across the board, no matter what the situation is. Right? And what is that? Only act on maxims that you can universalize. So let's go back to the seemingly harmless, innocent maxim of most people going to the grocery store. When I am hungry and have no food, I shall go to the grocery store and buy food. These are my notes. I'm quoting my own notes. So applying the categorical imperative, we'd ask ourselves, is that something that could logically be a universal way that people behave? Yeah. Is that a way we'd want people to universally behave? Sure. So there doesn't seem to be any reason why you couldn't do that, right? Or that we wouldn't want people to act in such a way universally. So that passed the test. We've applied the categorical imperative. Provided you've gone through this rational process, and I've alluded to this rational process throughout the first part of the lecture, then, and act accordingly, then you are morally praiseworthy, regardless then of regardless of what transpires in experience afterwards. We've talked about that, right? Provided you engage in this rational process and apply that categorical imperative to the maxim you're about to act on, then you are morally praiseworthy, regardless of what then transpires. Right? Let's apply the categorical imperative to our other maxim. When I am in need of money, I shall rob the closest bank without getting caught. Remember the categorical imperative. One must only act on maxims that can be universalized. Can't universalize that. Therefore, I have a duty, right, not to act on that maxim, not to go rob my local bank when I'm in need of money and try not to get caught. Okay. So he's arguing, turning to slide 24, this is, again, if we want to proceed with some semblance of morality, this is how we have to proceed. Right? We have to have a moral theory that's based on something pure, right? Let's root it in pure reason, he would say, and rationality, and remove all subjective inclination and desire from the equation altogether, right? Then and only then are we going to have something pure enough that will truly satisfy, or stand up. As he says on 203, quote, the necessity of acting from pure respect for the practical law or the moral law is what constitutes duty, end quote. 209. This is the quote, in this purity of he's talking about moral conceptions. In this purity of their origin lies their very worthiness to serve us as supreme practical principles. And to the extent that something empirical is added to them, right, we're doing something based on inclination instead or something to do with our experience, just so much as taken away from their genuine influence and from the absolute worth of the corresponding actions. Again, the more we let our inclinations factor into why it is we're doing what we're doing, the less morally praiseworthy what we're doing is. Right? Instead, we have to act in this rational manner where we're always applying the categorical imperative to whatever it is we're doing and making sure that we're not violating the moral law, right? Doing something that we wouldn't want or that couldn't be a universal way of behaving. Okay. I know this stuff is heavy, guys, so bear with me. Hopefully it's starting to make at least a little bit of sense. That really is the most important stuff, I would say. what's the word I'm looking for? You know, the heart of things, right? The meat of what he's getting at. So from here on out, we'll reference some more peripheral points, but really make sure you have a handle on that idea of duty, goodwill, these propositions of morality, and what he's getting at there. And especially know that idea of the categorical imperative, because that then is going to be our ticket to figuring out what all our duties are. Because we basically just always, again, you can lock yourself in the closet, imagine any particular scenario, and then a way you would, act. Can I universalize this way of acting? No, I couldn't. Therefore, I have a duty not to act in such a way, right? Without even going and living out your experience, right? You could mull over all of this over, figure all this out purely in a rational way, without consulting experience at all, so to speak, just by applying the categorical imperative to all these conceivable scenarios, right? And he's going to give us some examples here in a moment. Let's go ahead. But first, I actually want to allude, and I've mentioned this as being an issue. You might remember, when did I think this is in my housekeeping at the beginning of the lecture 10 video. I mentioned try to keep distinct what they're saying in theory versus the practical issues that might arise from trying to carry out their theory, so to speak, or to test it, or however you might want to put it. For example, the utilitarians tell us that the proper thing to do is always do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's the theory, right? And maybe they're correct, and that is actually true. That's what we ought to do. And maybe it's the case that in practice, practically speaking, there's no way we can actually do that. Because we just don't have the means to carry out, let's say, all these long, complex calculations, or whatever, however you want to put the point. Again, they might still be correct. And so the same kind of point, I think, applies to Kant. Remember, I think, as I mentioned that at the time in Lecture 10, I mentioned that I would be alluding to something similar with respect to Kant. Kant might be correct that what dictates moral praise and blame ought to be the motive or intention of the agent, what the person has in mind, and whether or not they reflected on their duties and applied the categorical imperative and so on and so forth. But what's the problem with that, practically speaking? The problem is, how do I know? You tell me that you did that, that you cleaned up your room out of the goodness of your heart, right? But how do I know that? How do I know you're not just doing it because you didn't want to get grounded again, right? So my kids tell me stuff all the time, right? And that suggests a particular motive. But how do I actually know what their true motive was? How do you actually, and that's what matters morally for Kant. But yet that seems, in some sense, almost, if we're being honest here, inaccessible. How do I ever know, or to any degree of certainty at least? Kant, to his credit, seems to acknowledge that and actually takes it a step further. So turning to slide 25, note the admission he makes on page 215 of the text. He says, quote, "It's always possible that secretly there is fear of disgrace and perhaps also obscure dread of other dangers. Such fear and dread may have influenced the will. Who can prove by experience that a cause is not present? Experience only shows that a cause is not perceived," end quote. So he's saying, in other words, we might think our motive is pure and that we're acting, in a pure manner, devoid of, being influenced by our own inclinations and so on and so forth. But he's saying, how do we even know that we ourselves are truly acting in this pure manner and that we're not actually being, say, subconsciously driven still by our own fears and wants and so on? So he seems to acknowledge, right, this issue of this inaccessibility to what matters most for him, this idea of the intention or motive, or and then correspondingly rational reflection of the agent. That's a big practical issue, but nevertheless, what he's saying in theory might still be true. So I think that point deserves to be made again. Okay. Blah blah blah. So I said that. Okay, I think we're ready then to discuss Kant's famous 4 illustrations of duty. Now, we'd already talked about how we figure out our duties. Whatever it is we're about to do, formulate the relevant maxim, and ask ourselves, it's going to be kind of a 2-part question. Could this even possibly be logically a universal way that people could behave? And then if it satisfies that, let's say, right, would it be a way we want people to universally behave? And that's going to then get at the distinction between, so we're talking about this notion of duties, And we have a distinction between perfect duties and imperfect duties. And then we also have a distinction between duties to oneself and duties to others. Okay. So, this idea of, I'm going to try to, on slide 26 here, right at this moment, I'm going to try to give a sort of cursory, preliminary explanation here of this distinction, but I think then it'll become a lot clearer what he's getting at as we get into his examples. I already alluded to the two ways something can be a duty a moment ago, but we'll flesh that out in much more detail as we go through the examples. I wanted to point out that every duty we have is either a perfect duty or imperfect, either or, and every duty is one or the other. And so too, every duty is a duty to oneself or a duty to others. So if you do the math here, right, we have 4 possible combinations here. And how many illustrations of duty does Kant offer us? 4. One of each of those 4 types. Okay? That's no accident. Okay, so what does he mean by having a... So this, let me just begin by saying this one's pretty self-explanatory, right? Something I owe myself, right? A duty to myself versus something I owe others or duty to others, okay? This one needs to be unpacked though, and it'll take, maybe some examples to really get a feel for what Kant means here. But basically he's saying, so take a maxim, right? We're always applying the categorical imperative to a maxim to figure out if there's an applicable duty here, right? So we're taking a maxim, and the idea is when you apply the categorical imperative, the CI, I'm going to reference it as the CI henceforth. You apply the CI, your question is, first question should be, anyway, is this even conceivable as being a universal law? When I think of this, not just me acting this way now, but everyone in a similar situation acting this way all the time. Could that even be a way? Is that even conceivable? Or is there some sort of logical or rational issue in even trying to conceive of that being a universal way of behaving? If there's a logical or rational hang-up or issue in trying to even conceptualize it being a universal way of behaving, then we have a perfect duty not to act on that maxim. Okay. There's either, so I should say, there's either a logical or rational issue in the very maxim itself, or in the process of envisioning it being a universal way that people behave. Okay, so if there's some sort of logical or rational hang-up, right, involved, then we have a perfect duty not to act on the maxim. If, on the other hand, okay, it could conceivably be a universal law or a way that people universally behave, but we wouldn't want it to be a way that people universally behave, then we have an imperfect duty not to act. So we still have a duty then not to act on that maxim, but in that case it would be deemed imperfect. Okay. So I already said that. I quote him and how he puts that point about imperfect duties. He mentions that on 218. I'm not going to read the quote though now. And I mentioned then the distinction between duties to oneself and to others. That's much more I think clearly understood. So moving on then to, let's go ahead and go through these famous 4 illustrations of duty. We have the depressed man. So he's down on his luck, right? And he's contemplating ending it all. So the question is it contrary to his duty to himself? Okay, so we're talking about duty to oneself here. Possibly a duty to oneself. We'll see if there is one. Is it contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life? So the maxim in question, right? Always try to formulate, isolate, identify what the maxim is. Okay? The maxim in question, as Kant says on 217, is, quote, from self-love, and I think that's an important, part of it there. From self-love, I make as my principle to shorten my life, i.e., end it, when its continued duration threatens more evil than it promises satisfaction, end quote. So Kant wants to say there's a logical hang-up here, right? That this can't be logically universalized. Hence, it's going to be a perfect duty to oneself. Perfect duty to oneself, not to kill ourselves, basically. He thinks it's contradictory, this notion of killing oneself out of self-love, right? Or that very idea of terminating one's own existence can make sense, right? That's in some way rational. So he thinks there's a logical issue in the very maxim itself, right? So in that case, then, right, we have a perfect duty not to act on that maxim, and that's a perfect duty to ourselves. Okay? In this case, not to end our existence. Okay? I like his second example much more, the false promise example. So here we're going to have, whoops, perfect to others, and I'm just writing this shorthand, obviously. So here we have the man who's compelled to borrow money and to promise to pay it back, right, knowing that he won't be able to. So imagine that sort of mentality, or the isolate the maxim. Imagine that being universalized, or try to anyway. So what would the maxim be? As Kant says on 217, quote, "When I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, although I know that I can never do so," end quote. So he wants to say, logical issue here, because as soon as you take the step of envisioning that being a way that everyone behaved, everyone just made promises all the time, I promised to pay you back, and never ever did, then the very idea of a promise would be laughable. It would fall apart, right? It wouldn't be credible. The very thing you needed that was in play here wouldn't even exist, right? There's a logical issue then in trying to conceptualize a world where that was a universal way of behaving. As he puts it, quote, "It would make promising itself and the end to be attained thereby quite impossible, inasmuch as no one would believe what was promised him, but would merely laugh at all such utterances as being vain pretenses." So that, end quote, that's on 218. So again, we have a perfect duty to others not to make these kinds of false promises. Right? So those are the two illustrations of perfect duties, and hopefully, I think the second one makes a little bit more sense, right? The idea, again, as soon as we imagine a world where everybody acted this way, you couldn't even make a promise anymore, right? Okay, so moving on to example 3, the lazy dude. Here we're going to see an imperfect duty. So here we have this guy that, let's face it, could be the next Einstein, but instead prefers to lounge around on the couch eating Doritos and drinking Guinness all day. So he prefers to indulge in pleasure rather than develop his natural talents and gifts. Contrary to the first two examples, Kant wants to say we could logically conceive of this being a way that people universally behaved. Everybody was just universally bums, right? Lazy bums. But Kant wants to say, nevertheless, we wouldn't want it to be the way people universally behave. So therefore, we still have a duty then, in this case, imperfect. Whoops. To oneself. In this case, perfect duty to ourselves, right? Not to neglect our own natural talents. Instead, we have a duty to develop them. Okay? So even though we could logically conceive of this being a way people would universally behave, Kant thinks we, quote, cannot possibly will that this should become a universal law of nature, end quote. And that's on 218. He thinks that we, for various reasons, as rational creatures, we want to develop our abilities to as best we can. Something along those lines. So let's turn to then slide 30. This is the last and the final illustration of duty. We have I want to say, yeah, wealthy curmudgeon, maybe. Let's put it that way. So you guessed it, right? We're going to have imperfect. Sorry about the terrible handwriting. To others. Oh my goodness. I don't even know if it's worth writing at that point. I mean, does that even mean anything when it's just scribbles? I don't know. That says wealthy curmudgeon, imperfect to others. All right. So here the idea is we have somebody that's really well off, but is of the mindset that they're not going to get involved in the plights of others. They could, but hey, I'd rather just stick to myself, and everybody else sticks to themselves. Kant wants to say, look, we could imagine a world where everybody acted this way and just ignored one another and never was, sympathetic and so on. But we wouldn't want it to be a way that people universally behave, because if nothing else, Kant suggests, we ourselves are going to be in a position, aren't we, where we're in want of the need and help and love and support of others, and we wouldn't want them to reciprocate this way of behaving. Right? So we wouldn't want that to be a universal way of behaving. So again, we would have an imperfect duty to others, not to neglect them when we have the capacity or ability to help them. And we referenced this before, right? We do have a duty to be benevolent, to help little old ladies cross the street when we can. We do have a duty to do that. Because for no other reason, Kant says, because we wouldn't want to be shunned ourselves if things were reversed. So, although this could coherently be a universal law of nature, it's impossible for the prosperous man to will it to be one, quote, as cases might often arise in which one would have the need of love and sympathy of others, in which he would deprive himself of all hope of the aid he wants for himself, if he were to universalize this way of behaving. End quote. So that's on 218. Oh, we are almost done, ladies and gentlemen. Almost done. So there are the famous 4 illustrations of duty. Know the underlying distinctions there and how they apply then. So hopefully it makes some sense now, perfect versus imperfect duties. All duties are one or the other, and all duties are either a duty to oneself or to others. All right, hang in there. I think we have 3 more slides. Basically, all that's left is a distinction between autonomy, and I've already sort of explained this, really. So Kant wants to say this goodwill, right? It's going to be acting, the rational agent that possesses it, right? It's going to be acting completely autonomously. And the problem with all prior moral theories, although they might have had this sense and notion of duty and talked about duty, they had that right at least, they failed to hammer home or emphasize the sense in which the agent themselves has to come to this themselves, right, through their own rational reflection. Instead, all these prior moral theories, right, emphasize the sense of duty as if it was mandated, right, as if you have to do this or else, right, as if, it's more like the state threatening to, imprison you if you don't, right. Whereas again, Kant wants to say, no, this has to be something that we're not sort of doing because we feel threatened, right? Rather, it has to make sense to us. It has to be something we come to completely autonomously of our own accord and through rational reflection. Okay. So that's what I'm getting at on slide 31 and the next few slides thereafter. So he's discussing why he thinks all previous, again, moral theories more or less failed. Quote, and this isn't included in our particular excerpt, but Kant says it, quote, man was viewed as bound to laws by his duty, but it was not seen that man is subject only to his own, yet universal legislation, because again, whatever he concludes, if he's acting rationally, will be something that will apply universally, right? It's objective. But it was not seen that man is subject only to his own, yet universal legislation, and that he is bound only to act in accordance with his own will, end quote. Another quote along these lines, also not included in our excerpt, quote, for when man is thought as being merely subject to law, whatever it might be, then the law had to carry with it some interest, right, an inclination, functioning as an attracting stimulus or as a constraining force for obedience, inasmuch as the law did not arise as a law from his own will. Rather, in order that his will conform with law, it had to be necessitated by something else to act in a certain way. So it's not good enough that you're just following the speed limit because you see the speed limit and don't want to get a ticket, right? You have to understand that, right, rationally engage in the process, understand, that it's not okay. You can't universalize speeding, and therefore that has to be part of the reason, right, or the motivating factor for why you're not speeding. It can't just be that you don't want to get a ticket or go to jail or whatever. That's what he's getting at here, right? You have to come to this not just through these external factors, right, but through a rational, internal, autonomous process of reflection. Right? So again, 32, kind of going on the same point. We have to be acting completely autonomously. Prior moral theories they don't hammer that point home enough. So long as a moral theory is founded upon the following certain guidelines imposed by others, tradition, etc., will be ill-founded because, again, it's resting on interests, consequences, threat of imprisonment, of a ticket, etc. So heteronomy reflects a will that's being dictated by all these outside factors, right? steered in different directions because of these external factors. And to be truly morally praiseworthy, right, we need to be acting completely autonomously. So moving on to our last slide, 33, acting autonomously is going to be necessary to be truly morally praiseworthy, but it's not going to be sufficient. And this is a nice segue into our next lecture, lecture 12, where we'll talk about William Frankena, and he offers 3, I think, nice criticisms of Kant's deontology. And very brief lecture, very succinct. Again, he does a great job of articulating what a lot of people are thinking with, in terms of criticisms with respect to Kant's theory. And so as we'll see at the beginning of that lecture, we'll wrestle with this idea of necessary and sufficient conditions. And so the idea is acting autonomously, that's going to be necessary for you to be worthy of moral praise, but it's not going to guarantee, it's not going to be sufficient in order to know that you're going to be morally praiseworthy. It's not going to guarantee that you're morally praiseworthy, right? You might decide, as I point out, to steal the cookies from the cookie jar completely of your own accord, but obviously that's not morally praiseworthy, right? So you have to do what you're doing completely of your own accord, right, through a rational process, but that's not going to necessarily guarantee that you're still doing something that's morally praiseworthy. Okay. I think that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Finally. So that's Kant's deontology. I know there's a lot there. If you have any questions, be sure to ask them. Otherwise, we'll leave you with the reflection time questions. So if you didn't answer one of the intermission questions, be sure to chime in on one of these reflection time questions. Let us know what you think of deontology in general. What would the world be like if everyone was a strict deontologist like Kant, constantly reflecting and applying the categorical imperative to every maxim they were about to act on? I guess maybe it wouldn't be too different than an act utilitarian who's constantly performing utility calculations. Anyway, until next time, we'll talk about, like I said, lecture 12, William Frankena, some of his criticisms of Kant's deontology, and that'll be the last lecture then before your section 2 quiz. So then we'll move on to section 3 with lecture 13, where we talk about Aristotle and virtue ethics. But that's 2 lectures from now. Again, lecture 12, we'll talk about William Frankena and his criticisms of deontology.